Welcome back to the Career Sprout Academy. We are finally on to part one, module 4, which is called Defining Your Career Nirvana. To me, this is arguably the most important module of the entire program, and not just the module, but this is one of the most important steps you will ever take or should take in your career. And it's called Defining Your Career Nirvana. And so in this module, we're going to first talk about what is your career nirvana. How do you define it? Why is it important? And then once we know what that is, then we're going to define what the next step of your job search will look like. And then at the end of this module, I will also provide you with some assignments, some working examples, that you can focus on to help you figure this part out and give you some clarity on what to do next. So before we go on, let me first just take a second to kind of walk you through why I truly believe this is the most important part of your entire career and why you should take the time to figure this out. So first and foremost, what is career nirvana? Career nirvana is figuring out what you want your career to look like. It is figuring out a destination. It is figuring out a goal, right? And why is that important? Well, as the old saying goes, if you don't know where you want to go, then any road will get you there. And as I mentioned at the time of recording this, we've helped now a little over 700 people through our program. But outside of our program, I've talked personally to thousands and thousands of professionals and job seekers through workshops and interviews and owning staffing agencies, you name it. And I can tell you that 95% or more of the people I talk to, they always tell me the same thing, that the biggest regret that they have in their career was the fact that they didn't take the time to figure out where they wanted to go or how they wanted to build their career or what they wanted to ultimately do. And as a result of that, they bounced around from one company to the next, from one job to the next, not really getting clear or on what they actually wanted, therefore not really knowing what skills to build, therefore just taking basically any job that came their way. And before they knew it, they had spent so many years doing something that they didn't find fulfilling. They didn't build any skills that they could take advantage of and leverage and move up in their career. And so they felt extremely behind. Now, there's a way to make that up, but still, this is a feeling that I never want you to feel if you can help it. And so again, arguably the most important place you can invest your time before doing anything else in our program is taking the time to figure out where you want to go and getting really clear on that, or as clear as you possibly can. So how do you define your career nirvana? Well, I have an analogy I want to use here, and it has to do with M&Ms. And if you've heard me talk about this, forgive me. If you haven't, hopefully you enjoy it. So let's take a second and assume that I told you, well, let's assume for a second that you lived in Los Angeles, okay? Doesn't matter where you truly live. For the purposes of this analogy and this example, I just want you to assume that you live in Los Angeles. And I told you that I want you to drive from LA to New York, but you cannot use any GPS device. You can't use any map. You can't have anybody in your car. You literally have to figure this out on your own. And let's also assume for some strange reason that you actually had to listen to me. Well, I know you're smart enough to figure out that if you just drive northeast long enough, at some point you will certainly get to New York. We know that much. What we don't know is how long is it going to take you to get there? How many times are you going to get turned around? How many times are you going to get lost? How many times are you going to get detoured? How many times will you stop at places you shouldn't have stopped at? And how much gas will you waste? How much energy will you expend? And how frustrated are you going to be, right? We know you're going to be frustrated. It's probably a lot. But we know, again, at some point you'll get to New York. Now, what we also can assume is by the time you get to New York, well, also where in New York you end up, we don't know that either, right? Let's keep that atop of mind. just because you're going to New York, we don't know where in New York you'll end up. You could end up in Buffalo, and forgive me if you're in Buffalo or know people there, but who the heck really wants to live in Buffalo? You could end up in some really dangerous part of the city that you don't want to be at. But again, you will get there. And because it took you forever and a day, because you're so frustrated, because you're so tired, because you burn so much gas and energy, etc., you'll likely stop and get out of your car by the time you get there, go and check into a hotel or an Airbnb or whatever, and chill out for a minute, right? We also don't know how long now you're going to chill out. Now, let's take a second and assume instead, I said, I want you to go from LA to the M&M store in downtown Manhattan. And this time you can use any GPS device that you want. Well, now we know exactly what you're going to do, right? You're going to take your phone or your GPS device, whatever, you're going to plug in the M&M store in downtown Manhattan. And what are you going to get? You're going to get the most quickest, fastest, effective route to the M&M store. Your GPS device will literally tell you exactly what to do. What it won't show you on your GPS device is what not to do, right? It'll literally just tell you, take this turn, take that turn, go here, drive here for this long, etc. Now your journey won't really feel frustrating. It might feel long to some point, but it won't feel frustrating because you know exactly where you're going. And you know that you're taking the most effective route there. And you might get rerouted, but the only reason you would get rerouted is because it's finding an even faster, more effective route for you. And by the end of it, you get M&Ms. Now think about this as it relates to most people's career, right? Might even be in the situation you're in. How many people do you know, or how many times in your own career have you stopped at companies you shouldn't have stopped at, or stayed at companies for far longer than you should have stayed? How many times did you bounce around from one place to the next without really knowing what you wanted to do, without really feeling fulfilled, without truly being happy? Instead, you probably stopped again, like I said, from one place to the next, to the next, to the next, stopped at places you shouldn't have stopped at, stayed at companies for far too long, worked at companies for toxic culture, worked at companies that didn't really help you develop and get you career clarity. And now you feel stuck, or this is where people feel stuck. Well, the reason that is because they never took the time to figure out what their M&M store was or is. And that's why I think this module and this part of your career is extremely important, because I want to save you years of agony. I don't want you to jump around. I don't want you to feel frustrated. I truly want you to feel like you're going in a direction that aligns with your goals and your mission and your values and all the other things. And again, even if you get rerouted a couple of different times, you won't be bothered by that, because you know that what you're doing is getting you closer to your goal. And that's what we're going to work on figuring out through these exercises in this module. We're going to figure out what is your career nirvana / M&M store. And when you do this, when you start going through the exercises that I'll share with you in a minute or a few minutes, you want to make sure you are taking a very holistic approach as you're thinking through what you want your career nirvana to look like. And by the way, this doesn't have to be your final destination, because again, as I mentioned in the last module, it is really hard to figure out where you want to be 20 years from now, because the world and technology changes so much, right? There's a lot of companies that were around 20 years ago that are not around today. So instead, you really just want to think about 5 years from now, 10 years from now, kind of max at that point. But when you think about this, like I said, take this holistic approach and take the time to figure out what is the ideal company you want to work at? What do you truly want to be doing? What do you want to be paid? What do you want to be working on? What kind of culture do you want to work for? Who do you want to work with, right? Get extremely granular. And here's the other kicker here, and this is truly important. Before you ever put down on paper what you want your career to look like, it is extremely important to first figure out, what do you want your life to look like? How do you want your lifestyle to play out? Why is that important? Because most people are truly happy once they figure out what they want their ideal life to look like, and then find a career that best supports that life. versus chasing arbitrary goals, right? I don't want your life, and I don't want you to become a slave to your career. And maybe you've already experienced that and you know that that's not fun. But instead, I want your career to support the lifestyle that you want to have. You know, when I talk to a lot of people initially on strategy calls, etc., I'll always ask them the same thing. I said, tell me what you want to do. And so many people will say, oh, I'd love to work at Facebook, or I'd love, or Mang, or Meta, whatever it's called, or Netflix, or Google. And I'll say, why? And they don't really have a good answer for that. And really, they're speaking from a place of ego, because they believe, and maybe you feel this, that by working at one of these huge big 5 tech companies, you will finally feel validated, that society will think you are truly successful. But when we start peeling back the onion, I'm like, well, tell me what you want to do. And they're like, well, I want to work on a product that I find exciting, or a project I find exciting. I want to work with really cool people. I want to get paid what I'm worth. I want to feel respected and recognized. And I want to have a culture that really supports my development and my growth and my lifestyle. And so at the end of the day, I'll say, okay, so truly what you want is, you want to work for a company that you really respect, a company that ultimately respects you, a company that supports your development and your growth. You want to work, you want to do something you actually find fun and you enjoy. You want to work with smart people, and you want to get paid what you're worth or more. And they'll say, yeah. And I'll say, well, then you can achieve that in so many companies, not just the FANG or Mang companies. And so what I'm kind of getting them to understand is moving away. I'm trying to get them to move away from chasing what they ultimately realize is something that's arbitrary and something that they're kind of making up in their head, and instead putting them on a path that moves them towards a direction that they would find fulfilling. So in other words, you want to build goals that will support your ideal life, ideal being the key word here, and then unapologetically go and pursue your goals. And again, once you have a destination in mind, again, even if you get rerouted from time to time, at least you know that you are moving in alignment with your values and something you would enjoy, rather than bouncing around from one place to the next and just drifting around aimlessly. And one of the ways you can go about doing this is, you want to sit on the shoulders of giants. You don't need to recreate the wheel. What does that mean? It means literally go and follow or look at other people who have already achieved what you want to achieve, because success leaves clues. Instead of getting frustrated and trying to do things that other people haven't done, I promise you, unless you're building something that's never been built, somebody out there, and likeliness is multiple people out there, have already done what you want to do. And so instead of trying to figure out how they do it, go and look at what they've done, and it will tell you how they did it. Their path will show you the right path to get there. So the best way to figure out how to grow your career is to find out how other people have grown theirs. And the best tool to use to help you to do that is LinkedIn. So when you go to LinkedIn, you know that top left-hand side where there's that search bar, go and type in the search for the ideal title you want to be in 3 to 5 years from now, right? So for example, let's say you want to be a CFO. Well, and let's say it's of a publicly traded company or a privately traded company, or you want to be a fractional CFO, or you want to be a head of product, whatever. Type in head of product, CFO, etc. Whatever you ultimately want to be doing 5 years from now, 10 years from now, type that into the search bar in LinkedIn, and then begin studying the profiles of the people who are already there today, and look at what they've done to get there. Now, some profiles will have very limited views. Some will have tons of information. The idea is you want to study at least 15, 20, 25 different profiles, because the reason you want to study that many profiles is because you want to look for a throughput. What were most of these people doing that they share in common? What paths did they take that most like 80% of these people all took? What was that? Did some of them first work for publicly traded companies and move to privately traded companies? Did some of them do et cetera, et cetera? Look for and study what other people did. And maybe through studying this, you'll also notice that they took on certain projects that may have been a little bit outside of their wheelhouse. Maybe they got certifications that you haven't even thought about that really help kind of propel them, make them much more attractive to their future employers. So look and study. It's called career mapping. Look and study the careers of the people who are already doing what you want to do. The coolest thing out of this whole exercise, outside of like kind of starting to get clarity on what you need to be doing, is you'll ultimately see what the next step of your career should look like. So for example, let's say you're an accountant today and you want to be a SVP or a CFO. That's your career nirvana. Well, now you know, after studying all these profiles, that most people were once accountants, then they became senior accountants, then they ultimately became controllers, etc., right? VP, whatever the path looks like. And after you study a few more, you'll even notice, did some of them work for startups? Did some of them work for enterprise? Is there a common sort of path that they all took, right? When did they move into leadership roles? Were they at any point consulting? Did some of them first start off as entrepreneurs? And this opens your mind up to options, right? You don't have to, by looking at this, what you should gather, again, is not only what your next step should look like. That is ultimately the I would say the biggest sort of clarity piece that you'll figure out is what's your next step, but it tells you over time throughout your career, what options do you have? Because you might realize, and this is a really cool feeling to know, is that there's multiple ways to get where you want to go. And then you can kind of start picking and choosing the route that's best for you. It's like those books, if you remember when we were kids, the Pick Your Own Adventure books. It's like that. And so the more you study how other people grew their careers and ultimately landed where you want to go, the more you will realize how you can get there. And here's a really cool framework that you should utilize. So it's called the career progression life cycle. And basically, the way to think about this is, in everyone's career in the workforce, exclude entrepreneurs. I'm talking about the workforce, 9 to 5, okay? Corporations. There's usually 3 stages to everyone's career. So the first stage is what's called learning. Now, age doesn't kind of matter, but I'm going to give you some perspective here, okay? Or some further context. So stage 1 is what's called learning. Now, think of this as like your early to late 20s, maybe early 30s, okay? Depending on when you started, how you started, whatever. In this stage, you don't truly care about what your title is. You don't care so much about your pay. Instead, what you want to focus on is racking up as much experience as you possibly can. And as in addition to that, some accomplishments along the way. Right? So the more you can gather this experience in your particular skill set, the more valuable you'll ultimately become. And if you're gathering a ton of experience and ideally some accomplishments, then it is easier to move into stage 2. Now, stage 2 is what's called earning. Now, think of this. If we were to put an age on it, doesn't always have to be this way, right? I've seen it go a lot of different ways, but in general, this is now, think of like your mid-30s, early to mid-30s, all the way to like your early 40s, maybe mid-40s. This is where now you are going to capitalize on everything you just learned and accomplished in stage 1. And if you are interested in moving into leadership, this is typically the stage where you start moving into the early parts of leadership. So if you're thinking titles, this is where you become a manager, a senior manager, director, maybe even senior director, right? And in tech, depending on what you're doing, let's say product, this is where you're kind of starting to get to like the $200,000 range or slightly more, depending on the company and the total comp plan, okay? But now you are literally capitalizing on everything you just spent the last X amount of years doing. And you're moving into the early parts of leadership if you wanted to. Also, from this stage comes your final stage, which is called steering, like you're steering a boat. And now what you're doing is you're helping a company move in the direction that aligns with its mission and its vision. And you're doing this typically in the capacity of a senior leader and or an executive. So think like senior director, VP, SVP, C level, right? Where you're in the 3, 4, 5, 6, 700 range, maybe even in 7 figures, again, depending on size of company, etc. Right? Now, why is this important? Think about how many times, based on where you've worked, how many times have you seen people in their late 40s or 50s and certainly in their 60s being managed by somebody in like their 30s, late 30s, early 40s? Probably a lot. The question you want to always ask is, well, why is that happening? It's because that person in their late 40s, 50s, 60s typically didn't move through the life cycle fast enough. Now, it's not to say that you can't move through it even if you're at this age, but typically the reason they're stuck in that place is because they didn't move through the life cycle fast enough. And now usually, especially in tech, they are now deemed as somebody who's not cut out for senior leadership. Now, I know from a fact, having coached so many people, that that's the furthest thing from the truth. It's not like they're not cut out for it. They just were never given the path. They were never given the opportunity. Maybe they didn't know what their career nirvana was early enough. Maybe they got complacent. There could be a plethora of reasons why they didn't move through the life cycle fast enough, but no matter what it is, most companies will now deem them as somebody that's not cut out for senior leadership, and they kind of get stuck in the place that they're at. And so that's why they are there. So you want to ask yourself, well, what stage am I in today, or am I stuck in? And then you will compare that to the career mapping exercise that you did here, right? And you'll ask yourself, well, then now that I know that I'm in this stage, where do I also want to go? And what's the right next step for me? And that doing this exercise, knowing what stage you're in, knowing where you're stuck, and then kind of comparing it to the career mapping exercise you're doing will give you so much clarity on what you should do next. But even if you're slightly still unsure, another great framework you can use is called big fish in small pond versus small fish in a large ocean. Now, what do I mean by this? So typically, now this doesn't always work out, but typically I would say 80, 90% of the time, the earlier you are in your career, right? So if you're in stage 1 of your career, regardless of where within stage 1 you are, but if you're in stage 1 of your career, maybe even in stage 2, it is so much more advantageous for you to go and be the small fish in a large ocean, meaning go and work for a really big company. Again, it doesn't have to be a Mang or Fang company, but just a large enterprise company. The reason is because when you are a smaller fish at a huge company, you gain so many advantages from this. One, you get really good at the thing or the 2 things that you're responsible for. So you really know how to do product, you really know how to do project management, you really know how to do analytics, whatever it is, right? Because you're only going to be focusing on that one thing. Usually when you work for a larger company, they are going to want you to focus on one thing. But because you're doing that one thing every single day, in addition to the fact that you're working with other probably senior level people who are way better at you at that one thing, you will typically level up a lot faster because your rate of learning will have increased. Instead, and I see this happen a lot, instead of if you're in stage 1 and you go and work at like especially a very early stage pre-seed startup, the problem there is it's as sexy as it sounds to work for a startup. The problem is they will usually have you go and wear so many different hats and you'll do so many different things. Now it's fun in the beginning, but the problem happens when you think 2, 3, 4, 5 steps down the line where you realize, dang, I've worked here for 5 years. I've done so many things. I don't know which one thing I'm actually good at. I don't know which one skill set I can really leverage. I don't know which area I can go. And this becomes extremely disheartening once you've been laid off, because now you don't know how to really write your resume because you're like, dang, I've done so many things. And a huge company, and most companies, think about this, will never want to take a chance on somebody that's done too many things. They'd rather just go and pay, and sometimes overpay, the person who's just really good at the one thing that they need. So you want to avoid, especially earlier in your career, just working for a startup if they're going to have you work on so many different things. Now, if it's a venture-backed startup, late-stage startup, think Series E, Series F, where they're pre-acquisition, pre-IPO, then typically you're not going to face that problem because they'll hire you to do one thing really well. But now once you start moving into stage 2 and stage 3, you kind of want to, instead of being one of many, right? So if you remain at this large company, you are literally one of many. Think about how many directors of accounting there probably are at Google. Think about how many senior product managers or group product managers there are at Meta or any enterprise company, a ton, right? Adobe, think of it, there's a ton of these. And so it is really hard to keep moving up because there's so many other people gunning for the limited positions there are. So instead, once you've really mastered your skill set, once you've kind of like gotten experience as a leader, or even as an individual contributor, you then want to think about going and becoming the big fish in a smaller pond. Now go and work for a smaller company. When I went and worked for Overstock, it was, I'd say only, but it really, compared to its competitors, only a $2 billion company, but it was, it was a healthy $2 billion company. And when I got there, I got everything handed to me. I got the amazing comp plan, over 7 figures. I got to manage team of 20 something people. I got all the accolades, etc. I got it all because I was just a small, I was a big fish in a small pond. And it felt really good. And at that point, I didn't care to be at a Meta or a, it's one of its competitors like Amazon or Wayfair. I didn't want to be one of many VPs of talent acquisition. I wanted to be the main VP of talent acquisition because, again, I get so much more influence at that point. I get all the recognition, I get the pay, I get the team, the resources, everything I need to be successful. And it feels really good on top of that. And when you're later in your career, you don't really care to be one of many. You want to be the one, right? So think about these 2 frameworks, the career progression life cycle. Where are you in the career progression life cycle? How does that relate to where most people were at in your career mapping exercise? And if you're still unclear, then think about, know what stage you're in right now of the career progression life cycle, and then figure out what's the right path. Do you continue to be a small fish, big ocean, or do you go and be the big fish, small pond? Okay, so again, let's quickly talk about why is it important to define your career nirvana? Well, one, like I said, is because it gives you a destination. It helps you avoid drifting from one place to the next without really knowing where you're going, being unfulfilled, being unhappy, all the things, right? And what's so cool about this is, again, even if your goals change or you get rerouted on your path to your M&M store, you will be training your mind to be very opportunistic, and you'll be identifying opportunities that keep moving the needle closer to your M&M store. And what's so cool is the higher up you move, the more valuable you become. And the more valuable you become, the more opportunities will come your way, right? The more options that you have. The higher up you go, you've won when, even if you get laid off, it doesn't matter because you have so many different options you can choose from. Well, how do you get those options? It's because you will have made a huge impact. Well, how do you make huge impact? It's because you kept moving up in your career and taking on more responsibility. How do you keep moving up in your careers? By mastering the skill, and then mastering another skill, and using the frameworks that we talked about here. So it is extreme, and knowing where you're going also helps you understand what skills you should be mastering and which ones you should not really focus on. So, right. So at a certain point, you'll realize that you can ultimately pick and choose the opportunities that you want. That, to me, is the definition of success. That is when you know you've achieved career nirvana, when you can pick and choose what you want to do because you are so valuable. Again, even if you get laid off, it doesn't matter. So that is why we want to do this. So what will be clear after these exercises is, number one, what is your M&M store? And then number two, what is the immediate next turn you should be taking in your path towards the M&M store? Meaning, what is the next position you should go after? And just a quick disclaimer, because some people do get held up on this. And the reason they get held up is because it can sometimes feel very overwhelming to think about how you want to build this career, to think about where you want to go, tie that to the lifestyle you want to have. But rather than get overwhelmed by it, try your best to get excited by it. If this is a blank canvas and you can pick and choose where you want to go, knowing we're going to be helping you to get there, then pick what's ideal for you. But again, if you get too overwhelming, I don't want you to get stuck on this, so stuck and get analysis paralysis or whatever they call it. And instead, just use the two frameworks we talked about, right? The career progression life cycle. Where are you today? Where should you be going? And then based on that, should you be doing the big fish, small pond move, or should you be doing the small fish, big ocean move, right? So at the very least, define that much. And then we can still utilizing all the strategies that you'll learn in the later modules, you'll know based on that much what you should be doing next. And then we can still get clear on that as we progress. And so side note is, if you're somebody that is making a career transition, like you are literally going from, let's say, finance to product, and people do that, finance to marketing, marketing to analytics, whatever it is, it might be a little bit hard to say, well, what skills am I supposed to highlight? And so, or what role should I be going after? Well, still, you want to look at those two frameworks, do the career mapping exercise, see where other people are at, and look at the skill sets they had by the time they got to those positions, which will then kind of make it clear which position you should go after next. And then think about what skill sets, experiences do you possess today, or that you possessed or gained all throughout your career, that are most transferable to the new job that you're going after. Okay. And if you don't know where you want to transition into, then you want to research which careers most allow you to play to your strengths. So you want to think about, what are the strengths when you're thinking about this career path? Think about, up until now, what are all the problems that I've helped solve? Right? What problems did I get really good at solving? Which problems do I want to continue getting better at solving? Think about also, what are some of the biggest achievements or impact that I helped achieve through solving those types of problems? And then again, this is if you're trying to figure out where to go next. Then look at that and say, well, now start researching, or go into the community and ask, what are some of the skill sets that would best allow me to play to, or what are some of the jobs I should go after that would allow me to play to my strengths, but still allow me to make a transition? For example, we had somebody that once was a teacher and she moved into customer success. We had somebody that was once in aerospace sales and he chose to move into customer success. Or we had somebody that was working in the restaurant industry. He was actually going and selling beer and liquor to restaurants, and he went from that to tech sales, right? We had somebody that was in retail cosmetics for 11 years of her career, like all 11 years of her career, she was selling makeup. And she used that experience to go and get into tech sales. Then she used that experience to go and do enterprise sales at Salesforce. And then she used that experience to go and become a director of global retail at a thriving tech/cosmetics company. Right? So how did she do that? How did these people do that? Is they first took the time to figure out what problems they got really good at solving, which skills have they developed, and then figured out, well, what are the career paths that would allow me to still play to my strengths and my skills and still make a successful pivot. So again, I don't want you getting held up on this step if you're getting too overwhelmed by it. I don't want you to have paralysis analysis. I want you, at the worst case, just to figure out where you are in the career progression life cycle. How does that match up to the big fish, small pond versus small fish, big ocean? And then map out some other people's careers who are at where you want to be. Okay. Once your career nirvana map is complete, I want you to print it out and put it somewhere that you can see every single day. Look at it every single morning when you wake up, every single night when you go to bed. Visualize yourself. Know how it feels to be in that career. And this might sound like woo-woo, but the more you can feel and visualize where you want to go, the more empowered and the more sort of like energy you will have going towards that, right? Energy goes where attention flows, energy flows where attention goes. And so you want to be focusing on this, and you want it to be very granular, like I said. And, one of the things you can think about, and I've had this happen a lot, is this goes back to chasing arbitrary goals. You don't have to go and assume that you need to be a leader. We have plenty of people who are extremely successful who remained individual contributors. We have one client who is a principal customer success manager making over $230,000. As a principal customer success manager making over $230,000. Now he has had many opportunities to move into leadership, and he chose not to move towards that. Why? Because he's told me flat out, he's like, look, I have 2 young kids. I love spending all my time with them outside of work and my home responsibilities. I play the drums and I'm in a band and I like doing that. And I like going on these gigs and I like all these other things. And, because he's in the role that he's in, at some point, if and when he chooses, he can always move into leadership. But for now, he doesn't want to. And so as you're thinking and getting granular about your vision of your M&M store, where you want to see yourself, make sure you're getting granular and go back to the exercises and the slides in this module and look at what are the things you want to be considering. Think a lot about also what are the values you cherish as a human being, because you want to make sure that the company you ultimately choose to go to also shares those same values, or the leader that you work for, he or she, shares those same values. The people you work with share those same values. That culture embodies who you are as a human, what you find valuable, what your principles. So think about all of these things. Make sure you map it out. And if you get stuck, post questions in the community. Okay. So this wraps up part 1, module 4, which is defining your career nirvana. What we're going to do next is research your next job, but don't move to the next module until you've figured out what your next job should be. All right, I'll see you there.